Good evening, folks. Welcome to another Rev Talk with me, the Rev, obviously. And tonight's guest, somebody I've been wanting to chat to for ages since I saw his book being reviewed. And we'll touch on the book in a bit. But welcome, Steve Saxty. Thank you so much for joining us from the other side of the world, it must be said, in wonderful Manhattan. Thank you very much for joining us. For those who don't know Steve, and I'm going to give him a chance to share a bit of his story in a minute. Steve has written some absolutely illuminating books on design history, particularly in the Ford Motor Company, and it's those books that we're kind of highlighting tonight, and particularly the story of the last Escort, the Escort that never was, and then the Ford Focus. And it's an up and down story, but it's absolutely fascinating. And Steve has been very kindly able to join us tonight to share with us that story. Steve, I mean, it's a heck of a story, and we'll touch on that in a bit. But starting from the beginning, how did you get to write it? How did you want to write it? What's the seeds of where you are tonight, really?
I think, and I'm not sure, but I think it goes back to a U2 concert. And I was thinking about this myself the other day, and I love music, and I don't think that Bono's lyrics are necessarily all that insightful, but when he rambles on occasionally, you can listen to the concert. And he talks about, and it's a famous American writer from the 20s or something, write the book you've always wanted to read. And for some reason, I sort of had it rattling around in my head that was quite a cool concept. And I thought about a book I always wanted to read, and I was like, it was noodling around, and I thought, well, when I was a kid, Ford was just like unstoppable in the UK. And that's all I ever wanted to do, was to work for Ford as a car designer. That's what I was a little 16-year-old. I didn't know any different what a car designer was from an engineer or marketing or anything. I just thought, that's what I want to do. And over the years, sort of Ford has had its ups and downs. And what I go back to is my sort of days as a child in the 70s and 80s, when Ford was in its sort of rock star mode from a design perspective. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool to do a book about Ford in that era? And so the first book I wrote was about 4 years ago, called The Cars You Always Promised Yourself. And it went on to be a Book of the Year finalist, and it was well received and everything, and it sold out. And I never planned to write another one, to be honest with you. And that was that. Back to my day job in marketing and consulting world, and I was like quite happy with that. And the life of a sort of pitiful author was not for me. And so that was it. The book was done, and that was through the three lens of design, engineering, and marketing. But although I've worked most of my time in marketing, design is what I really love, and I can speak the language of design, engineering, and marketing equally, but the one I like and love the most is design, but I speak more marketing, really, in truth. And so that was it. The project was done, and that was sort of 2-3 years ago, and on we go. And then there was this thing called COVID. You've probably seen it in the news. Like the rest of us, I'm sort of stuck at home. And I was like, what should I do? And I thought, in a degree of naivety, I can't believe, I thought, I'll write another book. And writing a book it's not something you undertake lightly unless you're really stupid. And I do claim to be quite stupid. And so I thought, I know, I'll write another book. And I knew from The Cars You Always Promised Yourself, the first book, that people loved all the design sketches. And I'd scooped up a lot along the way from there. And your question is, how do I get started there? And that's really where it got going, was the realization that people love, like I did as a kid, all the secret stuff, because the cars that didn't come out, the rumors and all of that stuff. And I realized that I'd done extremely well with that book. And those images came in part from Ford's PR archive that's in Germany. So they don't really let people into that usually. And that came about really quite by chance, because as I started reaching out to people that used to work for Ford, I kept getting loads of stuff coming into me. And I thought, this is getting a bit hot. It's all this stuff's got top secret, confidential on it. And I thought, I better actually just tell Ford I'm planning to do this. And I sort of wrote blindly to a PR person. I had no idea who they were. And I said, look, I'm planning to write this book. I've got lots of stuff from former employees. Is this going to be okay? And they said, we'll come back to you with our official response. I thought, well, that doesn't sound very good, does it? And so the official response was about a day later, we wish you every success with the book. What you obtain from a third party is entirely at your discretion. Let us know if we can help. And I thought, if they just completely okayed this, and behind the scenes, I was later nudged off that there were lots more conversations than they were letting on, and they quietly decided they checked me out, my background. In fact, I worked for other car companies as well, and they thought, you know what, we'll trust him. And so it snowballed from there, if I'm honest with you, where from the get-go, as the Americans say, they were really trustworthy. And then it sort of, I thought that was it on the first book, and I thought I'd done really well to get into the archive in Germany, which and the people that hold that archive in Germany said, well, there is the design archive, but we have no access to that. That's really top secret sort of thing. And so it came to the point where I thought, shall I just do a book on secret Fords? You know, because I've got still stuff lying around. If I start asking a little harder and pushing on Design's door, and I'd made contact with him by Amco Leonards, who is the chief designer of Ford Europe. He's a great guy, terrific guy, and he's so excited. He's done his own little YouTube videos of opening up the book. I mean, he's delightfully geeky like the rest of us. I think he'd probably be proud to say that. And so I said to Amco, look, I'm thinking of doing another book. He said, and he straight away said, what do you want? What can we do to help? I said, well, is there an archive in design? He goes, oh yeah. He said, but it's all manual. He said, but you know what? I'll scan it for you. And what I hadn't realized was what he meant by that. He was going to have somebody scan 5,400 images by hand. So that's where it came from, is somebody on a flatbed scanner scanned, and I've met him and I've thanked Andreas for doing it. He has scanned 5,400 photos on a flatbed scanner in the middle of the design studio in Germany. So that's where a lot of those images come from. And I'm still amazed to this day that a car company said, you know what, we're going to give you complete trust. Off you go. Here's everything.
I mean, that in itself is incredible, isn't it? That you get this kind of open access. And I mean, the book is, I mean, it's, for those that haven't seen it, it's brilliant. You know, there's so, I mean, this is just volume 2, and
that's 1 or 2, yeah.
Volume 2, and I've got volume 1 as well. And there are just, I mean, so many pictures and photographs and sketches that, having been involved in design myself, I know that those things do not get let out of a design studio, and yet here you are. And I mean, I want to pick up about gear, because I mean, not only did you get access to the design files, but you've also had access to gear, and that's something else again, isn't it?
Oh, well, that's one of the more bizarre things, really. So this is where, and you picked up volume 2 there, it turned into 2 volumes. So when I started this 2 whole years ago in the depths of COVID, my plan was to do 1 book. And I thought that would be quite an interesting book, just sort of a trot through. And what happened was I was connected with somebody in the archives in Detroit. So the images that I'm using are all from Germany. So most of my connection with Germany, there is nothing held in the UK of any great, of the older stuff. And it's been sent to Germany, sent to Detroit from the UK, and that's been digitized. But the archives, and of course, they've got millions of images in Detroit. They're not all digitized. And so I wanted a few odd images. I reached out to this contact I was given in Detroit. And one day he said, yeah, I've got these images of an Escort Capri. Would that interest you? And I thought, and he said, another one is a Sierra-based Capri. And I'm like, what? And he said, let me scan them for you. I'll send them over. And I said, well, this is amazing. He said, well, I've got a list. He said, they've never been opened. They're a sealed archive. But I'll send you the PDF. And there are hundreds of cars that Gear made. And that's in volume 1, I think, Adam. I know we'll talk about more later stuff today. But the fact that Gear were off making cars, and they were stripping down Volkswagen Siroccos to make into Escort Capri hybrids and drivable cars, and all these hand-built Italian one-offs that if they didn't have a Ford that looked the right shape, they'd just strip it down. They were making a supercar. They stripped down a Lotus Esprit Turbo to make, this is what they were doing. My jaws would drop out. I couldn't believe it. And this is how it just turned into 2 books, because as soon as I got that, and then with Amco's permission, all the stuff that were really forming the backbone of what became Volume 2, I just had so much material. And that's how it sort of spun off into, with all the sister books in it. Now there's 6 books in the set now. And we're just on the 2nd edition of Volume 1. That's a 2-book set now because it's sold out. And we said we'd talk about Volume 2 today, but that's how it just kept expanding. So what turned out as a plan to do 1 book over COVID ended up 2 years of my life and 6 books later. And the new one it's just launching next week of Volume 1, the new version of Volume 1, and that's it. And then it's done for a while. But,
now we're just getting a few questions as to whether this is on Revs Limited. So what we're going to do, if it's okay, is we're going to come out of the Zoom live, and we're going to go back in and just double check, because there are some people saying yes it is, and some people saying where is it. Oh no, we've got, if people could let us know. I'm sure this is on Revs Limited, but I just would like people to confirm one way or the other, just so that we know that we're okay. I'm assuming it is, because it usually is. We'll carry on. And then if anybody says no, it isn't. Peter Birtwistle says I'm still here. Steve Harper says good evening both. So I'm assuming we are okay.
Hello, Steve.
We will carry on. So you've got this amazing access. You've got this kind of open door, and you've got all these files and things being given to you, which, I mean, you must kind of be pinching yourself sometimes and thinking, my goodness, how did I kind of get to this position? Because not everybody would get that. Well, hardly anybody would get that outside Ford, that's for sure.
Well, firstly, I didn't expect them to be quite so trustworthy, and they've been great from the beginning to end. I mean, I'm so impressed with Ford Motor Company and the trust they've given, but my first thought was to be almost a bit overwhelmed, because I could see this project just expanding and expanding, and I'm probably the only person that was hoping that COVID would carry on, basically. And I decamped with my wife to a small village in Maine, in New England. So I had this sort of dream environment overlooking the ocean, which is, who doesn't want that dream? So I had the dream of a project to write and a dream view every day. And then I had to start forming the narrative. I mean, the thing to appreciate is, in some ways, I planned it to be a very visual book, but there's so much of a story to be told, and that's why I had to realize I really needed to plot. Each story of each car overlaps, so it's a bit like it's not quite Game of Thrones, but it's very complex in the narrative of all the people that come and go, because that's what I wanted to try and bring alive, was the people, because I'm sure you'd agree, Adam, the key thing about this industry is the people. And so I wanted to introduce all these faceless designers, all these legendary leaders, so people get to meet them at work, and their different styles and their influence on the company, because all car companies use a sort of PR sort of washover where it all becomes corporate bland. This was a chance to pull it open and people to meet Bob Lutz at work, and people to meet Patrick Lecamont at work, and people to meet Harm the Guy at work, and people to meet all these names that followed over the decades. And so I took it reasonably seriously, but what I would say is the most amazing thing is how open and cooperative all these people were. And during the course of it, I think I spoke to about 200 people, something like that. Not all of them just designers, but I must have spoken to, I would imagine 50, 60 of Ford's designers, and the hours they gave, hours upon hours for interviews. I mean, they loved what they did, and I cannot thank them all enough. I try in the sort of thank you section, which I hope people read when they get the books, but they were so good. They were so passionate about it. I mean, and one of them I won't name, but his wife was desperately sick, and he still kept giving me all this time to do it. And people were just, it was their passion as well to write the story. And I it sounds a bit like an Oscar speech, but there's an element where I couldn't be more overwhelmed with the thanks and help I got from people. I mean, it was almost cathartic for me and for the company, I think, to tell the story.
Did that not kind of make you think, oh my goodness, this better work out?
Oh, totally, yeah. I mean, there's a little bit where, I mean, I'm really beyond proud of it, but I also am acutely aware that I could have turned it. I mean, it ended up bloating into different versions. It's the 6 books I mentioned, but I think it could have been a universe of 10 different books if I didn't stop myself, because it's just such a huge story. And every time I looked at new stuff, I couldn't believe what I was finding. And the biggest problem I have is when you look at the book, there's only like 2 or 3 pictures of a car, but I've got 10 of them. And I never knew what to do. People keep saying to me, well, can't you share them online? The trouble is, you can't curate 5,000 photos online. I'd be doing it for the rest of my days. It would be turning to a museum. So I sort of feel so bad. And that's why I love talking about them, sharing them on video, and some of the stuff we'll look at today. Is just, it's amazing, some of these pictures. It really is. But yeah, overwhelmed. There were times when I was overwhelmed by it. I won't lie to you. I set such an aggressive time frame. These were 14-hour days working on these books. I mean, people either imagine, I think writers are sort of, you know, penniless or billionaires. They're one of the two, and they imagine they're really lazy or really hardworking. I've seen that. So, and I'd like to claim to be hardworking and penniless at the end of this, to be honest. But goodness me, it was hard work. It really was. But it was a joy. It was an honour. I won't lie to you.
Did you get much sleep?
Once I've finished, I get a lot of sleep. The one thing you learn is you can't drink any alcohol. You can't write when you've got any trace of having 2 glasses of wine the night before. I managed to lose. Lost a fair amount of weight along the way, which is great actually. So that's quite healthy. So there you go. I learned from that too.
I mean, did you have sleepless nights where you kind of just thought, "What am I getting into here?"
Oh. There was that horrible, that creative moment, you'll know, where you get an idea and a concept in your head and it rattles around of how you're going to structure a chapter. Yes, because they're not like a magazine. They're not collections. Each chapter is not a self-contained story. They overlap like tiles on the roof with all these people. So you're weaving a story narrative and you're thinking about what's coming out 5 years in time. So you're literally like a movie plotting an end-to-end time frame. So yeah, it was a bit scary, and the easiest bit, honestly, was doing the writing. The most difficult bit is writing out your notes, planning it. When you write, it's like singing a song. You can sing it and write it with clarity. So it was hard work to get there, but the most glorious days were just when I could sit there by the water and write. But the hard work was just the hours of interviews, hours. You know. If anybody reads it and they like it, just feel for me for all the work that went into it, because it was a lot, you know.
I mean, I must confess, when I was kind of wading through the bits that we're talking about tonight, I just thought, my goodness, the detail and the number of different people that you're weaving into this story, and they're constantly changing, aren't they? Because
it's a rotating cast. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Where you start in that book is, and you know, there's people like Steve Harper and those on there tonight, gave me massive amount of help with Escort Cosworth as one of the man, quite right, and should be credited with the design of that car, along with Ian Callum. And then you go through to Focus at the other end, and you've got Dave Hilton, and so you've got different generations of designers come and go, and every one of them, to my amazement, got into it to the same degree. Remember, these people had never met. Steve Harper and Dave Hilton, the designer of the Escort Cosworth and Focus RS, never met, but they both got into it at the same degree and the same level of enthusiasm. And I was just amazed how everybody I spoke to got into it at the same level. And the saddest story was probably Richard Parry-Jones.
I was just going to say, we ought to mention.
So for that, I'm sure most people here will know who Richard Parry-Jones was. But so Richard and I had never met, and I was a bit intimidated when I first spoke to him. And to my horror and delight, we got on really well together, and he just kept teasing me, and he's like that. And I really get on well with Richard. And he wrote the intro for Volume 1. So Patrick LeCaymont as the designer and Richard as the engineer wrote the intro to Volume 1. And he said, I enjoyed it so much, can I do the intro for Volume 2? And you think, well, you can't say no, can you?
No.
So he wrote the intro for Volume 2, and he sent it through to me, and then he got an email and said, when are we going to talk about Mondeo then? And that was the last ever email I got from him before tragically he died like a few days later. And it was just awful for me to sort of know that I just missed having that first-hand conversation with him.
Yeah.
And the reason it was important to me, partly because I liked him, partly because he was so famous, but partly because this is not going to sound the way it should. I almost wanted to demystify Richard Parry-Jones because he was such such a thing in the press. And I realized I wasn't going to get the chance to talk to him firsthand so much. And I was getting on so well with him. But all of his colleagues were so in awe of him. And what I found was I was able to paint, and he's woven throughout Volume 2 in particular. And you get to realize how he changed the face of vehicle engineering and design. And I'm so pleased with it because, and that's why the book is Volume 2 is obviously it's dedicated to him. But you get to see firsthand what he did, because I'd read enough about him, but I didn't know what he did. And I really got a good feeling from all of his very senior peers, remember, that were around him, and even some of his bosses, just what he did. And I think that to me is probably the bit that's in some ways the testament that will live long after looking at the pictures in the book, is actually getting to understand his legacy. So that's probably, it's obviously tinged with massive sadness, but it's his last ever words are in the book. It's a very strange feeling.
When we kind of approached you and asked if you'd come and talk to us, I think one of the things that in that first conversation you and I kind of mentioned, obviously, is this sheer sea of people that are involved and different personalities and what have you. And I know both of us were very keen that we didn't just tell the story of the car, which we're going to jump to in just a second, but it was the people connected with it that were important. And that's what you bring out so well, and what kind of Revs is all about, this kind of people, the stories of people behind the cars. So to see his face and to see that introduction that he's written, and it's quite it's quite moving to see that, given that he's no longer with us. So very, very, yes, quite a fitting tribute in lots of ways. So should we get on to, Steve has very kindly put together some images for us as well. And this is one of the fascinating things about the book that you'll see if you've got a copy, or you'll see from what you'll see tonight. These images that are just kind of incredible to think that this is the development story and stuff that perhaps you won't have ever seen before. So Steve, should we start with seeing 14?
Let's do it then in that case. So so if I share my screen there, have you got it there? What are you seeing at your end then, guys?
I'm just seeing you still.
Okay, let's try that again then in that case. And here we go. I think that should be it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So you can see the two books there. Yep. So okay, cool. So Adam was showing you volume 1 there on the is volume 1 rather, which is just going to the second edition on the left there, and there's volume 2, which is what we'll talk about today. The blue car at the top there is C99, the cancelled Escort, and then because everybody loves the racy stuff, there's an Escort Cosworth Speedster there that was cancelled. So that's the cover cars there, which that's a whole separate conversation itself. Choosing the artwork, having custom artwork drawn, realizing that you're taking this custom artwork and asking Patrick Lecamon if it's okay, asking some of the guys at Gear if it's okay. It's like, there's no pressure there, that knowing your artwork's got to stand up to snuff. But what we wanted to talk about today, and this is really, I thought, a great idea of Adam's here, is just these two covers. Probably the worst car that Ford made, and the best car that Ford made in the space of 7 model years. They went from worst in class to best in class. And when Adam and I were talking earlier, I think it's really important to understand how these cars are about the people, and every car has its own story. And there is a real reason why one was so bad and one was so good, if I'm honest with you. And this is, and forgive me, this looks a bit PowerPointy, and most of this stuff is just looking at cars. So this is the PowerPointy bit. So bear with me, guys, because it's sort of vaguely interesting. So one of the things that I try and cover in the book is the whole world of product planning, not just people sketching cars. There is a bit of science and business behind this world. And the Escort of the 90s really has its genesis back in the 80s and indeed the 70s, when the Mark III Escort of 1981 was designed. And I'm sure most people are enthusiastic enough to remember the XR3 that you see there on the right, and that's its American equivalent. It's easy for us, particularly as most people in Britain, to sneer at the American version, but it sold really, really well. And put these two cars together, and the Escort was the best-selling car in the world. And it was a top seller for Ford. It was regularly in the top 10 list. It was regularly #1 at points in its career in America. So it was absolutely great. But Ford North America, went about it in two different ways. So in Europe, they were all about profit. So they learned to spin out all these different versions. You see them at the bottom. There was a van, RS, cabriolets. They kept dreaming up different body shells. And then there was the four-door. The Americans made the Topaz. Now, that's a long forgotten car, and it's pretty grim to look at. I totally agree, because it's got this great long nose. It's a longer version of the Escort. But this thing sold in the hundreds of thousands. And put that in context, that's outselling Mondeo on a good day at launch, back when Mondeo was a top seller. This Topaz, as bland as it looked. So from Ford's perspective in North America, they were shelling these things out in huge volume. In Europe, they're shelling them out in nearly as big volume, but the difference is in America, they weren't making any money on it. So they lost around about $100 a car, and they just didn't care, because it's all about volume. Because of the way that the regulations work in the States, if you can sell so many fuel-conscious cars, your corporate average emission fuel consumption goes up. You can sell so many more gas guzzlers where you make money. So they were quite happy churning them out in the States, making no money in big volume. Whereas in Europe, they were playing a much more complex game of selling more cars at high profit. So that's why you've got all these RSs and niche products and gears and all of this stuff, because they were always driving up profit as well as volume. So two different ways of looking at the equation. So that was the problem when it came to replacing the car, which is, what are we going to do? The Americans just want a cheap, reliable car that causes them no problem, does volume, and doesn't worry about making profit. Europeans, particularly as by the time the car was launched, Sierra was hemorrhaging money. They were losing a bucket load on Sierra. They needed to figure out what to do. So they had this big meeting in early '84. And as we mentioned earlier there, when Alan and I were talking, gear are sort of the heroes of the story. And this car, to some, might look, particularly from the rear, I haven't got any rear views there, looks a bit like the Mazda BG from the mid-'80s. That's because the American side of the house that were driving this program initially said, what can you do to make an advanced-looking Ford for 91 out of the Mazda platform? Now, this is so weird. It's difficult to get your head around it. This is 1983-84, and they're designing a 1991 car. That's how forward-looking gear had to be. That's the long lead advanced design world at work. And so these are pretty advanced looking cars from an American perspective for '83, it's fair to say. And the problem with it is Europe didn't necessarily want a Mazda-based car, and I'll come to the reason why in a moment, but they needed a 5-door, a 3-door, a 4-door, a van, a cabriolet, an XR, an RS, all these profit-making things. The Americans just wanted a 3-door, 5-door sedan, 4-door that they maybe could stretch if they wanted to, and a wagon. So they had much more utilitarian needs, but what North America wanted was a car that was cheap to make and caused no warranty issues. So they wanted to base it on Mazda. So there's a guy called Peter Slater was given the task of pulling this all together. And Peter is terrific. Peter said, look, I want it to be really clear. It's all my fault. I want everybody to know it's completely my fault. And it all went wrong because it's completely my fault. And Peter is very funny. And he said, but I do need everybody to know it's completely my fault. So Peter had to figure out what to do. So the decision was made to let North America go off and rebody the Mazda BG. And then the Europeans would make their own Escort because they had specific needs to make profit and all these different body styles. So that's when it split into two cars, okay? Mm-hmm. And this left Europe to go alone. So a year ticks by through 84, 85, and they start kicking things off. And there's an interesting point in time. If you look at the date on that car, that's 1986. Now, if you look at the side of it, I think everybody looking would just agree that looks like an Escort from 91.
Mm.
Well, that's still 5 years away into the future. And the long and the short of it was, this was one of the first clays that they made, and it's probably like the second clay they made. On the top there, you see a submission for a gear, and gear was still being asked to come up with a more modern looking car. But when Don Peterson, the CEO, saw that car, he said, no, the Escort needs to have the 6 light, the extra window, extra pane of glass rather, on the back. So this design you see here was progressed. And Helmut Schrader is one of the people I spent many hours talking to. And he was eventually the chief designer. He was overseeing Escort. And he said there was so much conservatism inside Ford at the time. We were so stricken with the Sierra's problems that this pleased everybody in every market research test out the gate. And so we just stuck with this car. We were also really squeezed because we had the Mondeo coming up and the Fiesta was running late behind it. So we had to design this car really quickly. So we did the whole thing in about a year. And they came up with this car, which is the one everybody loves. And you talk to Helmut, you talk to Patrick McCain, you talk to Harm, the guy, everybody loves this thing, which is a 4-door notch type hatchback. And the problem was in the market in those days, I think this car looks terrific, would have made a really nice Escort, but the market was split between you wanted the 4-door or you wanted a 5-door, but you didn't really want a 5-door that looked like a 4-door.
Mm-hmm.
And this car, I think everybody looks at it and goes, like got that punchiness of a Peugeot almost from the 90s. And this dates back to 86, 87. But they kept down the path of that car you saw there, that just a year later, they came up with these 3 alternatives. Now, usually when you're in the design reviews, and if you look through the Ford book or even others, you'll see lots of different alternatives at the final, what they call a bake-off. They just had 3 sisters that looked almost identical, with almost identical sides. And the novelty on this car is it's got flared arches. You probably can't see it in this resolution, but it has flared arches. The problem is the flared arches makes narrow tires. And today's cars have gigantic wheels and tires, but in those days you had like 155 tires. And so these tiny little wheels are sort of shrunk into the corners there. And because the Sierra was so controversial, what would have been the more advanced, punchier looking design is probably the middle one. Everybody at Ford exec level who are not given all the taste of a designer and probably more conservative than average designers said, no, you've got to go with a grille. So they went back to a grille which looks like a 70s style grille. And the design sort of almost kept going backwards rather than forwards. So the slightly more modern design in the middle didn't happen on the nose. I mean, it's just, and even the greenhouse, the glass shapes are the same between them. But, and Helmut Schrader said, and Andy Jacobson, who was his boss, he said, I just wish we pushed for a more advanced design. And so we ended up with this incredibly conservative design with lots of small bits of money saving. So the task was to save money along the way. And so what happened was the car was launched and it was just brutal, because one of the biggest mistakes they'd made on the car was they copied a lot of the rear suspension style of design of the contemporary Golf. But what they hadn't realized was the Golf used very expensive kinematic elastomer rubbers, and so that they've got compression and things like that. So the rubbers were much more sophisticated, and they just put straight rubber in, so the thing handled like a dog. And they completely missed how Volkswagen had saved money but produced a good handling car. They'd saved money, but they produced a car that the press just ripped it to shreds. And the other thing was the long lead time. So this car was signed off in 87, and it took another 4 years to get to market. And of course, in 4 years, you just know what happens. Everybody else is just moving forward and forward and forward. So this poor car was stillborn almost with, or hampered, I suppose, with just cost saving left, right, and center, and the conservatism within the company. And the designers lost their power. They lost their mojo. They also lost a lot of their designers as well. So some of those names that I mentioned earlier became the superstars of like Patrick Cayman and Harm Lagai. who were leading lights until early on in the program. They left, and so they lost a lot of their talent along the way. So so they were really, really drained of talent as well. So it was not a happy time.
I think reading the development of this car in your book, there are two quotes that come out at me, and I've read the chapters 3 or 4 times now since I got the book, and these quotes just keep jumping out. And in one, you write, there was a confidence, maybe an arrogance, that since Ford knew how to make a good Escort in 1985, then all they had to do was create a slightly better and more profitable one for the 1990s. And you can see how that kind of mindset just made it,
it was almost easy to design it, and it looks, by 86 standards, looks pretty perky sort of thing. But the world was moving. I mean, the world was just moving on at such a pace. And you've also got to remember, people like Rover briefly got their mojo back on design as well, which they hadn't expected. And so you've got that element where Rover 200 was coming out. They hadn't expected that to come from nowhere. That Rover suddenly were back on song with just rebadged Hondas were looking great. So they were really caught out. I mean, and it rocked Ford to its core. It was just so bad. And they spent such a lot of money continually working on it and facelifting it and spinning off derivatives like Escort Cosworth and all the cabriolets, but it just took up time, and they just didn't have the resource.
The other thing that you quote, and it goes back to that, well, if you're Ford, that horrendous front cover on Autocar is the damning sum up, which says average at most things and truly terrible at others. I mean, they're not. I mean, Peter Robinson, who wrote that article, he didn't pull his punches, did he?
No. Well, it's funny because Peter Robinson emailed me a few times as I was writing it, and Peter was more excited than anybody else to read the story. He said, "I'm just so keen to know what how you're going to tell everybody what happened." And I want to know. He said, "I want to know why it was so bad." And so, the guy that damned the car himself wants to know, sort of thing. So,
it's fascinating because I went back after our first conversation. And you very kindly sent me the books. I thought, right, the other thing I must get are those copies of that copy of Autocar.
Right.
And thank the Lord for eBay is all I'll say.
Absolutely.
But I also got the one the week before where they kind of revealed the Escort. And even there's a sense, they haven't even published the road test. That's for the week after. But even there's a sense of this recognition from the team at Autocar that really this car is not what it should be, and that despite Ford claiming they've spent $1 billion on it, which I think was the claim at the time, that really there just wasn't the result just wasn't kind of up to scratch. And I think there's one designer, Peter Stevens, who's a regular on Revs and is, funnily enough, my old boss at Rover. But Peter doesn't kind of spare his kind of critique of the design, and those two kind of Autocar and motors really stand out as this kind of damning indictment on the car. It's quite good.
Well, it's funny because I got to know Andy Jacobson, who was the boss of the whole thing, and he wrote in a sort of a postscript, not mea culpa, but he said, we got it wrong. They're acutely aware they got it wrong. They're under no illusion. What I do find amazing is in that saga, and it's in the book, that they were actually facelifting it before launch. So I heard about this in the press, but you'll notice, Anna, nobody facelifts a car before launch. They were actually working on it before they even launched the damn thing. They're off redesigning it. They were under no illusions, and if nothing else, they were lucky that they had Escort Cosworth, but of course that did tiny volume, but at least they had a halo model to follow. So maybe we'll look at Escort Cosworth now in that case and sort of keep things moving on. So this is I think if there's a hero of the fast forward world, it's this car, which is not really. This is 3 cars combined into one, which I find rather marvelous, actually. if you look inside, it's a Sierra, because underneath it is a Sierra stitched into an Escort body shell. But it's not just any old Sierra, it's the Sierra 4x4 Cosworth that's not out for another 2-3 years. So it's the Sierra Cosworth from the future stitched up into the body of the current Escort. And so when the car came out, the car that became the Escort Cosworth, it used a lot of the design language of the Mondeo. So it was sort of 3 cars in one, if you like, a mixture of Cosworth 4x4, Escort and Mondeo all mixed and blended into one car. But this car was the very first mule. And what's so fascinating about it was, A, it looks so great, and B, and I had to double check the figures, and I did, it was faster around the Boreham test track than the Works rally car. It was so fast and so light. This is a road car. Yeah. In Stig Blomqvist's hands, it was faster around Boreham than the Works rally car. It was amazing. So that's the way to sell in a program, is to make a drivable product. And this thing really fired the imagination. And Escort Cosworth is fascinating because there's so much discussion around who designed it and whatever, which I won't particularly go into here. But here's one of the really early sketches I dug out, which actually isn't even in the book. But this dates back to '87. Steve Harris, who's a long-term Ford designer, and you can see it's got the twin wing on the back there right at the get-go. And this is just the very, very first rough sketches that were given by one of the designers of just a make-believe to sort of bandy the idea around. And this is where the sort of story comes live, and I think Steve Harper's on the line here. This is Steve gave an awful lot of help here, along with John Wheeler, who's chief engineer on the car, and really this is one of Steve's sketches from early on in the Escort Cosworth program. And Steve worked for an independent design shop, and that was led by one of the other big names of both Ford and I think sort of that era's history, which is Peter Horbury. So it's really more Steve's car than Peter Horbury's car, and Ian Callum too. Peter Horbury was in orbit around this car as well at MGA, and MGA was an independent design shop. And I always find that era fascinating, whether it's TWR Design, MGA, IAD, all these independents in the UK were really pushing against the Italians. And Steve had done the Escort van, and that was massively well liked because it was one of the better looking derivatives of Escort. And so it was a natural that MGA were given the Escort Cosworth project. And so this car, fascinating, almost impossible to think about how John Wheeler did it. And I'm so pleased I got so much help from John. It's just a story of how he managed to beat the system. I mean, he's a hero, that guy. He's an absolute hero, how John Wheeler managed to get this car into production, which is to stitch an Escort, stitch a Sierra, a longer, bigger car, into a body shell of an Escort. I mean, it's amazing. And here we see the very first, and this was just a body shell that was being worked on here in order to do the first testing. And again, this is at MGA, the independent design shop I mentioned there. And Steve's got some wonderful stories in there of the bonnet flying off at 100 miles an hour, because this is a body shell. It looks like a real car, but it's just a body. It's one of the early bodies that's just been made out of metal, clayed up. And of course, there was no bonnet catch, so the bonnet flew off. And so some of the photos, it's got a steel windscreen because they broke the glass one. And here you see it in the wind tunnel there. And again, with the twin wing was set from the beginning by John Wheeler because it didn't need too much downforce at the rear. If you put too much downforce at the rear, obviously the front goes up, so you don't want any more than you've got there. So it was the right amount of downforce rather than too much, if you like. So it's really a front-rear aero testing. And again, I'm not going to discuss that too much length here, but it was really important to get the aero right on that car, and that was where it was one of those wonderful cars that's really developed in the tunnel. And it was close collaboration between Steve and then later when Ian got involved from Ford's side to bring the car to fruition. And this is an interesting sequence of shots here where this is the clay, and you see up there in that yellow sketch I showed earlier of Steve's up there in distance. And you'll notice that this clay, I mean, it's silver, it looks like a real car, but it's clay, has this sort of smiley front to it. That's because the dictate was to use the carryover indicators, and it looks nice, it looks sweet, it looks sporty, but what was being dictated was forcing the shape, and that's when Ian got involved. And this is the only picture I've got of Ian actually in MGA's workshops, and they worked together on it, of trying to rework that front bumper shape. So there was a little bit where it was a desire to bring in the design language of Mondeo into the car. And so what you see there is a nice combination of two noted designers, obviously bringing the car over the line to get to this. And this is, wonderful sketch by Steve here of the finished product. So I'm trying to go through it quickly here for speed, but this is a lovely combination of a design language from the Mondeo that wasn't yet out with the existing C14 language. So it's trying to look much smoother and more liquid, if you like. And it's very straight-laced, sharp-edged Escort. So it's a bit of design genius, this car, I think, where it shouldn't work. You've kind of got two different design language blended together, and the end result was absolutely iconic, and it's sort of loved even more now. I mean, the dark story on Escort Cosworth didn't sell particularly well, to be honest with you, and they were really sort of worried about it. So there's all sorts of ideas of doing coupe versions of it. This is one off the cover, but the original sketches are in the book of doing a speedster. So they were looking at doing a speedster version of it. And for those that love our fast Fords, it all sounds great. But the problem is that car would have been priced at the same price as the Porsche 968 Cabriolet. And at that point, I was working for Porsche and I was running a Porsche 968 Cabriolet. It was my company car because we couldn't sell them, basically. And because nobody wanted to spend £40,000 30 years ago on a 4-cylinder car. And so, sorry, lovely concept, but the prices just didn't stack up. So that never happened. But so much effort was put into sort of building volume around Escort Cabrio and Escort Cosworth, and this is another one that along the way people thought at the time was a concept car. They were really serious. This would have been Ford early on into the whole activity leisure market, was this thing. So this was going to be made, engineered by Special Vehicle Engineering that did the sportier versions, and made by Carman alongside, or maybe even substitute of the Escort Cosworth over time. And this was, engineering drawings were underway. This was all going to get, this car was called the Seeker, and this car would have gone into production, but never happened. Here's another one, again of Steve's here, which he kindly gave me for the book, rebodying it as an Aston Martin, and just look at the wheels. For those that know their Escort Cosworth, you'd recognise the wheels. Those are the wheels off of the Escort Cosworth model, and that would have been a potential DB7 option. Ironically, of course, Ian Callum did what became the DB7 a little bit down the road. So all these different ways to try and rebody, move the Escort Cosworth, move the Escort, not the Cosworth rather. But the thing is all these fancy versions, they're great, but they're tiny volume, really expensive. And the car you got to sell in volume is not the big heavyweight stuff. It's all those 1.4 LXs, and that's where it all went wrong back in the journey.
And as you say, if you're facelifting a car before it's even launched in its first version, then something is clearly not right.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And it's, they know what went wrong. I mean, this is one of those things. You look back in history, it was a textbook example of what could go wrong, did go wrong. They made the right decision not to share it with the Americans because the Americans wanted to go their course. What they tried to do was to make a low-cost, higher-profit, high-volume car, and it was just beyond them. They just didn't have the resource, and just the Escort never recovered. But what people don't know, and this is the story I'm sort of so excited that I managed to get for the book in chapter and verse, if you like, was not just this car, but the car in between, which was C99, the cancelled, the last Escort that never happened. So Focus in itself, and we'll come to it, is a fantastic story, I think. But what I find, because the geekiness all loves these things, is the genesis of of C99. So I'm glad to show it full screen, because in the book it's a small picture, but this car terrified people, and there's so many people remember this thing. So I'll talk about this for a moment. So the boss at the time was an American called Dave Turner. And Andy Jacobson, who I mentioned earlier, had moved back to the States. And Dave Turner was the new boss over the German and the British side of design. And he always wanted to be shocked. He always wanted shocking designs. And he was always pushing for something so advanced. And knowing that Escort had been crucified for its conservatism, he arranged for a big off-site talk in Sevenoaks in Kent. And he got the engineers, all these big wigs that are not designers. And designers are used to something that you bring it back after pushing it forward. He said, I'm going to show you a vision for the next Ford Escort. So he whips out these drawings. And this thing, if you look, it's got a depression in the roof. It's like, like 4 eggs in an egg box. And it was like there were almost fights. I mean, people were shocked. They were angry. There were tears that he was going to ruin. It was just brutal. And just the horror that somebody was going to propose this as a future is, and then this is just a thought starter. So C99 out the gate was going to be different. And that was the next generation Escort. And so this was, and I should show you the date. The date on that is 92. So that's just a year after launch. Yeah. C14 Escort. And this thing's like from the future, well, parallel universe, if nothing else. And so C99 started creeping along there. These are much more conservative designs, there's the oval mouth and things like that. And it's nice in places, so these designs, all of them are in the book. I just didn't want to go into endless detail here of all the different CE19s. But the design starts to mature. And then we get to this one, which is not such a bad looking car, really, is it? And this would have been around about 94. And by the standards of 1994, it's quite a high roof package. And there was talk about this high roof package, which we'll come back to in a moment. If you look inside, there's no interior to it. That's just a fiberglass model that's been used for a clinic. But nice little touches there of the lower rocker sills. There's a scalloping in there that's rather unusual. There's a line, there's a bead line that runs out the headlamps. There's some vaguely cool touches in there. And then one of the designers, Steve Harris, turns up with this one, which is this is the notchback sedan version of the car. And goodness me, that's something different, isn't it? It's got the classic lines of the past. It's got a look to the future, and all right, it's got the coloured bumper thing, which of course is a cost saving and all of that stuff, and everybody would have painted it. But there's some spirit to that car, and that's why it's one of the cover cars, because it's slinky. It really is a mixture of present and future. I mean, that's it's provocative. I mean, by mid-90s standards, it's pretty provocative, I think. So far, it's sort of trudging along this program, and it gets to the point where it's now starting to be reconsidered. What should we do with the American side of the house? So this is late 94, and there's a meeting in the States. And at this point, remember, they've gone off down the master path, and that's all worked, but the volume has never quite been where it was. It's doing okay, but it's like, and the Americans saying, look, we'll join in this program if you meet our need for catalytic converters, which raises the car up, and you give us a sedan that's going to look good. We'll buy into the program, which means your costs go right down. So suddenly America, from having been divorced in the previous generation, is now back in the game. And so the two guys that were leading it flew back thinking, crikey, we've got the chance to bring this all together. And so this is a gear proposal here for all these crisscrossy lines that are echoing the car, the 4KA. And I thought, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to have to make what they call a high roof package. So the Focus is really the world's first SUV because it's 2 inches taller than any of its competitors. So it's a really, really tall car, lots of headroom. And that package is a real challenge from a design perspective. And they were looking at it, and this is one of the early ones around the new package. And they said, okay, let's stop. Let's cancel CE99, completely redesign all the understructure, and we'll do a complete reset to accommodate all the American engineering requirements, and we'll make it taller, we'll make it slightly bigger, but we've got to package this high roof. And they were struggling out the gate, until they got one of the junior designers that was just a year out of school, called Boris Jacob, lovely German guy, really nice man, who came up with this sketch. And this sketch changed certainly his career, but Ford as well. This is called the X sketch. And he figured out a way to change the volumes at the rear of the car and to make a feature out of its height by drawing the eye to different places. And so this crisscross of lines, and I could talk about New Edge and stuff, but really, if you talk to designers, there was never really a theme called New Edge. It gets applied to this sort of theme, but it was a bit inconsistently applied, and it would be a distraction to talk about it here. But this is Boris's sketch, and it was done just speculatively, and they thought, well, we'll give it a go and make it into a clay. So they made it into a clay, and it was instantly sort of interesting. And Boris said, we did it off-site by the wind tunnel. It wasn't even done in the main studio. We did it not in secret, but we certainly didn't do it in the main location. And at the time, Alex Trotman, who was then the new CEO, came and had a look, and he said, guys, I know you're only kidding. I'll come back when you've done. And he didn't think that they were serious. But they were serious. And what freed them up, and this is where Richard Parry-Jones comes into the story, they started designing the cars because they were running late. The engineering of the car, these mules were made, they're about $300,000 each. And they were off making these cars with no bodywork. So there's no defined bodywork. Don't care what it looks like. So they were doing all the chassis tuning, and the interior design even was running ahead of the exterior. They were off doing hardcore engineering on the vehicle in parallel. So these are not mules based on the last Escort. These are actual C170, what became Focus, the C170 Focus running gear, installed in a completely arbitrary body just to start testing. So so they kept the program on track. These are massively expensive, like 300 grand to go, and they made, I think it was 14 of them, just to save time, to save a year in the program. And meanwhile, they started refining the clay. So they came up with 4 clays, and it's typical is the world of designers, they cheated by making sure their one that they favored won. And so the car on the top left is obviously the car that looks a bit like Focus, but you'll see it compared to the ones there. I'll show them on the next page there. The ones that it was facing off against. Of course, by comparing it to the Escort, that this is 1996, so that Escort was just being launched, that facelifted Escort with the oval nose. And then you compare it to this radical looking thing there. And the thing about it is, and I have to give full credit to a guy called Tony Pixton, who was the chief program engineer on it, is he wouldn't change it. He wanted to protect the design. So the engineers are always the one that muck them around and mess them about and things like that. And he said, no, we are going to make that car you see bottom left. And so these were the competitors to it.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Oh,
My apologies.
Siri decided to join in. Thanks, Siri. So what you see there is the alternatives that it was put up against, and they're not necessarily great, but they're not necessarily bad. But this is a company that's lost its way and trying to push forward. But really, the only car they had heart for was the one on the bottom left, which is the car that became this one. And this is still like a sort of second and a half generation of clay. There's still a lot to be finally done, but the sort of the trick work of trying to hide the height of the rear window and stuff like that. They put in so much work, but they were determined to protect what was Boris's design with that cross on the rear. And they got it. I mean, it was a once in a lifetime challenging design, I've got to say.
And somebody's made the point just now in the chat that actually looking at this and then kind of going back to CE99, you see some degree of that same kind of adventurousness that particularly the 4-door saloon that was kind of one of the last CE99 versions that was done, wasn't it?
Oh, for sure.
And there is a kind of direct correlation, and what's so nice is to see that risk taking that is such a contrast to 10 years before with the last Escort.
Well, particularly, and I probably haven't gone into it too much here, but particularly with the Americans being involved, who are more risk averse from a design perspective, with their, because the people that buy these cars are buying cheaper. These are not this is not your only car. Buying a car like this in America would be a low cost second car or a lower income purchase. So it's not a family car. So people are looking for more basic transport. So to serve up something like this, and that was one of the things that they were determined to do, is to try and make the estate radical, and they kept on pushing and pushing and pushing with the estate. And there's all in the books some radical, weird, wacky estate and saloon alternatives, because that was one of the things, is what works obviously that's a bit startling as a 5-door, and as a 3-door it works especially well, but trying to translate that over into a wagon, and they just about got there. But what they realized in the end is the wagon buyer is more conservative, so they didn't need to push it quite so much, and so that, that's where they ended up, was progressing the design where it was more conservative, but it still had the flavor of, and the sedan, the notchback version, was still more conservative, but it was still pushing things. So it's an amazing design story, I have to say. These two stories, the C14 Escort and the Focus design story, of just, and it goes back to people, is the chief program engineer said, we are going to make the most radical and best car we can, and almost fire me, dare me otherwise, and they did it. And then we get to it, and we won't have time today, I'm sure, is the Focus RS, which is a whole story in itself of a bunch of people that were doing it as an off-site project. I mean, that's an incredible story. Is somebody did it as a home project and sold the idea into Ford's boss, that they would design a Focus RS. So yeah, amazing story, I think.
And it's interesting because you've got these lovely little kind of almost kind of lead-ins to each chapter, and in the one on the Focus, you just say, sweep away the past and make the best. And that's such a huge contrast, isn't it? With I mean, it's a company that's been stung by conservatism and really has to do something different in order to kind of make a class-leading product again. And it's incredible that they, as you say, within a 10-year time gap, well, within the next year.
Even less, yeah. It was what, 91 to 98 model year. So was it 91 model year? So yeah, it was like 8 years. They went from being worst to best. It's an amazing story. I mean, and that's the take I get from it. That's the end of my pictures there, so I can probably stop sharing maybe. But pull out sharing here. Stop share. There we go. It's about leadership and it's about people. And what you get with the Focus people was, you talk to them, they said, we just had no choice but to make the best. We just couldn't do it again. We would kill the company if we didn't make the best. And I love their ballsiness of spirit. They were great. They really were, and the people on the C14 level go, we were acting under orders. We had to do what was right to meet the times. And so everybody did the right thing at the right time, but goodness me, the results couldn't be more different. So they're fascinating cars, those two. They really are.
We've got some great little comments. Chap called John Kiff, who I know really well. John was at Austin Rover doing product strategy at the same time, so he's been really enjoying hearing the other side, as it were, and the story from the other side. And Peter Birtwistle, who we've interviewed before, Peter, who was chief designer for Mazda Europe, and had a background with Audi, designing the short wheelbase Quattro, and with Porsche, and right at the beginning of his career with Vauxhall GM down in Luton. He says visited MGA, a great location, and actually, I like you, I got to see some of the people in those smaller little outfits that were doing these projects. I mean, MGA also very kind of instrumental in the development of what became the MGF.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they kind of work with that. And I know that when I was at Rover, we shared studio space with a company called RDS, who did a lot of stuff, kind of one-offs, and and did a lot of Sultan of Brunei cars, if I recall rightly.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. So all these, and you know, in the pages of car magazines, we often hear about only the bigwigs or the star designers, but actually you have all these really talented people working in these kind of little, warehouses or all over the country, producing stuff that comes out under a different badge, and they never necessarily get the credit for it. So it's fantastic to see those images. What for you, Steve, is next in terms of books, stories that you want to tell?
Well, I've just, as I said, finished that sort of second book. It's the last of the Secret Fords series for now, if you like. So there is that volume 1 that now turns into 2 volumes. So I've just finished that. So for those that have got the books, there is sort of one final treat in store, if you can call it that. Ford would be very keen if I did a volume 3 and bring it up to date. And they have one significant car coming that I can totally see why it would make a lot of synergistic sense to do that in time with that. That's an option, but I think equally there's a thought where, do we want to run them right up to the present? Because of course the present is always changed by the next day. The future always comes around tomorrow. And so, so I have actually started on the next book, and it's going to be one of the more famous German brands, noted for its design, particularly some of its more controversial designs. And they have promised the same level of access. Wow. And I think it will be fantastic to do that, and it will be nice to. I mean, you have to remember, because I work for Ford, Mazda, Jaguar, and Porsche. It's not just I'm sure most of my interest isn't just Ford sort of thing. There's a danger there that people think that I'm only into Ford, and so I'm fascinated to just go off and do another company that's also engaged the same way and promising, and so far delivering the same level of excitement and enthusiasm and commitment that Ford has. And then I might at some point do a volume 3 of Secret Fords, and I might do what I call a total RS book in every RS, or the Focus RS. I don't know. I think I've done so much on it now. I'll see what people want. I'll let people tell me what they want, I suppose is the truth. But for now, but the next project will be a big one. It will be a much bigger project, I think, even than these, dare I say. So
when that's done and out, and would you be up for coming to talk to us about that?
Yeah, love to. I mean, it's nice talking to you, Adam, because you know the business, and it means that it's an easy conversation to have, and I hope people enjoy it for sure. So,
I mean, people have just been kind of chipping in and just saying that it's fabulous, and it's been really enlightening, and
that's great.
And I mean, it would be great at some stage to get Steve Harper on as well. And maybe the both of you.
Or, definitely,
because Steve has, I'm sure, got some amazing stories too. And I know with Peter as well that we had, these are the things that people love, as you say. It's the stuff that didn't get to see the light of day. I mean, I'd love you to write a book about the Rovers that didn't get to see the light of day.
Well, I do talk. Well, there is a wonderful site that Keith Adams, I'm sure you know. And I've sort of encouraged Keith, if he can, to do a Secret Rovers one, because I think the whole Rover thing is really interesting, because the creativity in Rover, and I'd love to read it. I mean, if Keith doesn't write it, I'd love to write it, because I think it actually is a really interesting time. The problem with a book, I hate to say it, and people come to me all the time, is like, why don't you do a book on the Eggenberger Racing Sierras? And I go, well, because it will work out at £1,000 a copy. The commercial side of writing a book is not easy. These are not small endeavors to write a book, so you have to be really careful. So I love the idea of a Rover book. You just got to watch the volume, and that's why there's so many Porsche and Ferrari books. If because they're an easy sell, because they're coffee table books. The world does not need many more Ferrari books, I suggest. But some are good, some are indifferent. But it's just what sells at Christmas time. That's the problem with writing books, and it's really tough to write a book. I mean, not just because of the actual writing side of it, but to be vaguely serious for a moment of it, it's really tough because margins are so squeezed. I mean, people struggle to believe it, but I mean the likes of the booksellers want 50% in some cases, and the author gets such a tiny amount of money. Anybody that writes a book, thank them, because they're doing it for free. They really are. It's such a labour of love to write a book, and writing a car book doesn't make you J.K. Rowling, and it's because they want to do it. So anybody that writes a book, please, I urge anybody, not just mine, but any car book, if you got, buy them, because they need the support. They really do. And there's some good books out there these days.
Well, Peter Birtwhistle's saying bang on, because obviously Peter's written his story too, which again is a fascinating story and full of some amazing images and anecdotes and yeah, I mean, definitely, thankful to all of you who write the books, because I enjoy reading.
Well, it reminds me. You see, I must go and buy Peter's book, because I hadn't. It came into my head and went out the other side, and that's why I need to remember to buy it. And people should remember mine. We forget. We move on into the next thing. But these. If we don't record these times in history, they just get lost, and all you get is a bunch of Haynes manuals. And nothing wrong with the Haynes manual, but it's such a rich, vibrant, interesting industry. It has to be.
And I think that the industry is about to go through a revolution with the take-up of electric power, alternative sources. That all this, if we're not careful, we consign to history, and history we never kind of look back on. And yet there's, again, we come back and we say it at Revs a lot, and you've said it, behind the cars there are people, and it's the people's story, the different characters, those who were trying to make the best out of difficult situations, and those that like Richard Parry-Jones had the wonder of a kind of clear vision and a clear direction, and a sense too, perhaps, of timing, and very much he was able to perhaps do what he did because of the reaction to CE14 and the need to do something different.
He was the right man at the right time, and I think part of what I realised with Richard, as I got to know him over that time before he died, is he also has a lot of charm, and he sort of sing-songy Welsh voice. He said, well, I say to me, you can't do it. What are we going to do? And I could realise that you'd be faced with him as your boss. You wouldn't know what to do. And I'll just go away and fix him. Sorry. And it's like, sorry, I even asked it. Sorry, And so he was clearly an exemplary manager. Very special guy. Yeah. We need those.
We do. Steve, it's been an absolute joy and a real privilege for us. Thank you so much. I know we've been chatting for a while about doing this and planning it, and technological breakdown at the beginning notwithstanding. It's just been absolutely brilliant, and I really do encourage you, if you haven't bought this book, or the volume 1 and the volume 2, and you've enjoyed today, which is just a bit of what's in here, because I mean there's all sorts. There's Probe, there's Cougar, there's the Scorpio, and that's a story in itself, isn't it?
That's a whole episode alone. Scorpio.
And there's some amazing, just looking and seeing Ford Focus cabriolets, and I mean, there's just some brilliant stories in here, and again, some people that were kind of doing all they could to make Ford a winning company in their different time frames. So Steve, thank you so much. We really would love to have you back when your next book is out, and maybe we can talk about that company and some of the stories that you've done there.
Happy to do so. All right. Now, thank you for asking me.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much. And particularly because obviously we've got a 5-hour time difference between us and yourself. So it's been brilliant. And folks, we are going to be putting this out on our YouTube channel. I'll edit in the bit that anyone might have missed at the beginning, and that'll be going out on the YouTube channel in the next week or so. If you've got any ideas for REVTALK, or you want to tell some stories, I mean, we've mentioned Steve, and we've got others. I mean, Keith Adams would be another one. All these people with some really fascinating stories. and at the heart of it, it's all about people as much as it is about the cars. So let us know. Just a couple of things to let you know before we go. We're going to be doing another REVTALK next month, and we're just kind of slowly working on the idea for that, and we'll let you know more as and when that comes out. Also, just to let you know that the Pilgrim Tour, our second classic car tour, takes place this year in September and October. It's the late weekend of September, which rolls on into October. Tomorrow we'll be putting out on the group the full details of that, or some of the kind of preliminary details, where you can sign up, how you can join us if you want to. That's going to be a fantastic weekend. But for now, from me and Steve, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you again very soon. Please take care and God bless. Good night.
Thanks.